And this seems like an expansion to me.
Well, it certainly is. And again, because we're talking about, the whole globe. Like, the expansion is finally, treating the globe as a system. And Trump making the move on Greenland makes me think that he's wise to that. So there's two main things that we're talking about.
What's the connection with Greenland?
Space. I'm sorry, what?
What's the connection with Greenland with this?
Greenland's the high ground.
Go into more detail with that. What do you mean by that? Like
most of what's going on right now in terms of intercommunication is either going from the U.S. across to Europe. So the main path right there, past Greenland and Iceland. Very often those airplanes will do sort of a bend over those areas so that the airplane's not just out over the middle of freaking nowhere in case there's a problem, right? I would much rather, if I'm a captain, if I'm the FAA, I'd much rather go rescue an airplane that lands in an icy field in Greenland than try to rescue an airplane that lands, over here.
If everything's going to automate it, especially with the expansion of this whole 5G thing, wouldn't some kind of signal sender from space in a situation you're describing here really work as almost the guidance tool for something along those lines? If you were to use drone deliveries and mass scale on a 5G level, automated different components to that. So when you're talking about that land mass and things like Greenland and those delivery, that also has to have some kind of waves within the earth that it could connect, utilize in that sense, right?
Well, Tesla's original idea was that we use the ionosphere as a giant capacitor.
Right.
And there's all sorts of issues with that. What I wanted to show you, though, was really the scale we're talking about. Like, when we talk about Space Command, the ultimate goal right now is whatever's going on Earth, because that's really what's going on. There's, we got a few people in a space station as like a scientific endeavor. That's not a military installation, right? They don't have weapons. There are weapons up there. There's a big issue with weapons in space, but I want to start by pointing out the scale. If this is a scale picture of the Earth, these little X's are where almost all of the satellites are that we're talking about. They're barely even away from the Earth. There is quite a ways away, ballpark about 3 times the width of the Earth. Way over here, we get the geosynchronous satellites. These are the ones that we use for weather satellites and for communication satellites because it takes them 24 hours to go all the way around. So from the point of view of the world, they just sort of sit there in the sky. The guy who invented that idea, his name is Arthur C. Clarke. He's the guy that wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Oh, wow.
That geosynchronous orbit, that's a big deal. That's another type of high ground. We can imagine a time in the future where perhaps that might be a good place for the military to be. But other than that cool special trick, there's nothing special about that orbit. It's great for communication satellites. It's great for weather satellites. It also makes them sitting ducks in terms of a military operation because everybody knows they're there. They're not even moving, right? They're right there all the time.
Excuse me. Yeah.
So when we're talking about the Space Force, taking control of anything, we're talking about this like skin of satellites that barely get out of the atmosphere. And half of them are doomed over the years to fall back into the atmosphere anyway, because they're not really out of the atmosphere. They're just sort of in the really thin, shitty part where they barely get dragged down. So one of the issues when you're talking about the Space Force is what's the Space Force going to do anyway? Like, okay, so you got satellites that, killer satellites in space. What are you going to get away with? There's like 9,000 things up there that are bigger than a coffee can that we're tracking. And one of the videos is it's a link to all of the stuff that NASA tracks. Just to give you an idea how busy it is. It's kind of a junkyard. That's not even talking about, and this is a real thing, by the way. All these bits of junk are still up there. There's a thing known as the Kessler syndrome. If a satellite blows up, it makes a bunch of crap, and all that crap is effectively little bullets. Because those things that cross at right angles, like if they're orbiting together, it's no big deal, right? It just sort of spreads out like a bag of sand.
Right.
But if they're in opposite orbits, they're crashing together at 12,000 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So a little piece of sand, and yeah, here's an animation of how much crap is out there right now.
Wow.
A little piece of sand, or a screwdriver, or a paint fleck, or some a tool that somebody drops, or the washer that someone drops, or if someone actually breaks something and there's an explosion, there's little bits of junk. All that shit's still up there. The Kessler syndrome is this idea, and it sounds like the same name as the Kessel Run from Star Wars, but it's Kessler who talked about there may be a time, and it may be right around the corner if we get a new space command, Space Force doing this kind of thing. But yeah, if one satellite blows up, it makes a bunch of crap, and it maybe causes a malfunction or crap to break off another satellite. Or like that scene in Gravity. They have a great scene in Gravity. Maybe I should pull that one up, where these things crash, and it just makes this giant nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
And so
there it is.
That's one of the things that's almost certain to happen at some point. And it may be that when it does happen, space is going to shut down for a while. One possibility, if someone wants to get the upper hand with this whole, who's really in charge of space crap, one possibility is that they take, I don't know, maybe one rocket full of sand and just throw it in orbit. And all that sand just starts fucking up everybody else's orbit and deorbiting their stuff. It wouldn't be that hard to completely wreck space in a major way, or at least so it seems. It may be that bags of sand would clear space out in a way of the little crap and not affect the big stuff too much, at least after a while. There's a lot of theories about that. There's no real hard answers. We may get hard answers if the space war goes that way.
Space war, go in more depth about that, because just that, obviously it seems to be an inevitable conclusion just to progress, right? The
1967 Moon Treaty, and it's an open question whether they follow it, says there's no nuclear weapons allowed in space. There's been speculations for years that the Russians had nuclear missiles in space. The whole thing with Sputnik originally was almost the Soviets just sort of thumbing their noses, like, look what we can put over you. Like, who's got the high ground now, motherfucker? One of the ideas from the 80s, and I wouldn't be surprised if this exists and nobody's saying anything, is called Brilliant Pebbles. Have you ever heard of that?
I don't think so, no.
Right. Brilliant Pebbles, the basic idea of Brilliant Pebbles is that we have a crowbar in space, just a piece of metal that weighs 10 pounds, and it's got a little fin, and it's got a little radio connector, and when your computer calls up at the right time, the little retro rocket, the little CO2 cartridge, goes psst, and it deorbits this crowbar, and then the fin steers it, and you crash it into the tank or the boat or the building of your choice.
Yeah.
So here's a wonderful rendition of what happens when all this things spraying everywhere. And all these little pieces are all in their own orbits, and whichever ones are stuck in orbit end up hitting other stuff. And,
I see what you're saying. So because of the orbits created by debris, let me get this straight. So because of the orbits created by debris, basically, or the debris specific orbit and other things already in orbit in space, this could be something, as you were just saying, a handful of particles essentially could be damaging to another country depending on how far something like a space war went, right?
Yes, absolutely. And there's no question that if that kind of catastrophe happens, there's going to be real issues even using space. And this is something that there might be a mutually assured destruction situation, and Trump might have in his head that he's going to get ahead of that as well. I want to point out, I think I told you a bit about Kerbal Space Program, right?
You have told me a little bit, yeah. Real quick, before we do that, let me ask you this. Are you in favor of Space Force as described? Are you indifferent? Are you waiting on more details? What's your current take on that?
I think I'm not sure. That's the thing.
Okay.
In combination with Greenland, the fact that the U.S. has not really been doing much in space, this all makes me think that there's something going on. There's some new piece of hardware on, like, either.
So you can see where the strategy may be beneficial, just generally speaking, for the United States, and by default, that's probably a win in some sense for people of the world, or maybe a catch-up game of sorts for the United States. Or
possibly.
Okay.
That's the thing. I'm not sure. Like it's all Trump has some good instincts when the whole thing about Greenland really makes me wonder what's going on. And there's some of the modern laser weapons, some of the modern electronics. A drone in space would be easier to run than a drone in the air because it just has to sit up there. And modern electronics coupled with that Brilliant Pebbles idea. The idea of Brilliant Pebbles is basically to have meteorites that you can command on at will.
Gotcha.
This idea is like you have a crowbar up there, and you have 1,000 of them, and they're all flipping around in all sorts of different directions. And I lost that other video I had. If you can bring down your own meteorite, these things come in at 2,000 meters per second, 2 kilometers a second. That's basically a mile a second. You don't need to have a fancy bullet to take out an entire tank with one item.
Yeah.
And they come in so fast that they can barely see them. Meteors are like a blink of the eye fast. They do sonic booms because they are so loud. That's a really cheap weapon. We're talking about a piece of equipment that costs maybe a few $100 if you mass produce them. And if you wanted to put 1,000 up there, you'd want to mass produce them. And I wouldn't be surprised if some billionaire decides that he wants his own, because why not? Like, the computer technology exists.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of Chinese and Russians. The whole question about what exactly the Russians ended up doing, who's in charge over there, that's all completely up in the air. One possibility, the 3 pieces of equipment, the 3 ideas, which are all currently on the front burner, are the solar sails and the ion engines and the asteroid mining. And the asteroid mining was a big thing, and then all of a sudden it stalled. And I'm wondering, I have to wonder why, and if Trump doesn't think he knows something or knows somebody, and they're planning to make some kind of big prestige move. Because that's the thing, American action in space has always been about prestige more than substance. There's some talk about, Trump the businessman, maybe he'll bring something different this time. You tell me. I've given you some idea of what the situation really is. I don't think we're really talking about a moon base.
Yeah.
We're not talking about, because a lot of what's gone on in space over the years under a civilian rubric has been exploration, massive exploration. NASA's been great about that. JPL have been heroes. We've got images and knowledge about the planets and the little crap in space. Voyager is over 1 billion miles, or over, how far? I think it's now like 2 years. No, I can't even remember the distance, how far Voyager is. And that was one of the early cheap ones from the 70s. The modern technology is so much better now. So one possibility is that Trump is just trying to make a move and trying to get ahead of a process, and it's not really going to go anywhere, because the fact is nations aren't the future in space. And that's one very real possibility, that between transnational corporations like Fuji Heavy Industries or General Electric or Google or some other consortium of effectively untouchable entities, these abstract creatures, may end up taking space away from the democracies and the republics. And that's one possibility that Trump is maybe trying to get ahead of. Have you ever heard the idea of a transnational?
I mean, yes, but
like, would you rather be a citizen of the U.S. or a citizen of Toyota?
Interesting. I don't know how to answer that, to be honest with you.
What's that?
Sometimes it feels like one and the same in a sense.
Well, if you don't belong to a company, at least you can just walk around the streets of the country, right?
Yeah.
But what if there's no nations? What if it's only transnationals? And in a way, if you think of the resources of the world as being the people and the information and the material and the energy, then the territory is sort of a side effect. Maybe what we need to do is move our ideas about property off of the earth and into space, and we can start by working with the space right above the dirt. Maybe there's some legal framework that will make all that easier that we can start using now. Grunge is the idea, and again, this is Buckminster Fuller, that the world is run by abstract giants, 1,000-mile high abstract giants. It's actually about 20,000 miles, right?
Right.
That's about 20,000 miles. And whether the nation state is going to survive to be part of it is an open question. In so many ways, it's like the wheels are starting to fall off now. And this my speculation is that this is Trump trying to get ahead of it. And maybe there's some talk about, there's crazy ideas.
The wheels are falling off. You're talking about the wheels are falling off from a nation state concept is kind of what you're referring to there, right? Like the wheels are coming.
That's one possibility.
Okay.
Is that we're looking at Trump trying to stay ahead of a process.
Well, and I think that's something to underscore. Nation state in and of itself is a concept, right? That's a construction and abstraction of society. So this is a concept that even though people believe it to be absolute and true, it is subject to change always because it is, of course, an abstract concept, right?
Well, of course.
Yeah.
But the divorcing of the legal and social aspects from the territorial aspects, or maybe we're going to have to start talking about what is territory.
Well, so there used to be, and we won't go too far into this, but the relationship between things like social doctrine and order or rule, those weren't necessarily married in the way they are today, right? There was, in other words, there was more of a social doctrine, like a Hebrew doctrine, and then like a Roman order, for example, right? So you could see something like that on a larger scale conceptually taking place in something like this, where there's a social doctrine and then this almost international order of sorts.
Well, it's partly an update in our travel systems. Way back when, the center of civilization, the center of Western civilization, was the Mediterranean, and just having that easy travel because of boats between these civilizations made them all grow in a huge, huge way. Aristotle in Athens, he had in his head that there was no such thing as a social order bigger than how far you could talk. That idea was already proven obsolete by his existence because Athens only got big because of it's at the center of the big trading center. Right?
Yep.
The trading between Crete and Minoa and North Africa is what created civilization.